Are you a robot?
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon or good morning or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. My name is Ben Brabin and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar where we're going to explore the implications of the newly emerging European regulations on artificial intelligence. We have the most fantastic panel together today to share their thoughts with you. So without further ado, I'm going to invite each of our panelists to introduce themselves in a little bit more detail. But before I do so, I'm just going to give you their names. First, of course, we have Sarah Clark, Pamela Jasper, Sebastian Krier, Navrina Singh, and finally, Charles Radcliffe. So perhaps, panelists, if you can introduce yourselves in that order. So Sarah, if I can invite you first of all, just to say a few words of introduction.
Sure, I'm delighted to be here. I'm a specialist in data protection, governance, risk and compliance, having previously worked in cybersecurity. A lot of that time spent in the financial sector, in insurers, and then after that in all sorts of different business models, trying to essentially smooth, make lean, and try and exterminate staff less, with trying to do governance, risk and compliance at scale. So obviously I'm very interested in this because latterly I've joined the For Humanity Forum, who looks at governance in AI, and I've been made a fellow recently, so very much interested.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. And Pamela, if I can turn to you now.
Sure, absolutely. So thank you to Charles and the organizers for putting this on today. My name is Pam Jasper. I am the CEO of Jasper Consulting. And I come to this discussion by way of having many, many years of experience in the financial sector, having developed financial quantitative risk management systems, trading systems, risk systems, and in particular, a regulation as a program manager for a regulation in the United States called SR 11.7, which governs model risk management. So I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to speaking to everyone.
Thank you very much indeed. And turning next to you, Seb.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks, Charles, for organizing. Hi, everyone, I'm Sebastian. I'm a lawyer by training, but then went on to work for the UK government's Office for Artificial Intelligence as head of regulation. I then went on to do advisory work on AI governance, policy, standards, and ethics, which I still do, but will still be transitioning to work as a senior researcher at Stanford University. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Navrina, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to Charles and Ethics Grade to put this together. I am engineer by training. I've been in tech industry now for 2 decades. With companies like Microsoft and Qualcomm. Currently, I'm the CEO and founder of Credo AI, and where we are building the first end-to-end machine learning and AI governance, risk, and compliance platform. I also am a board member for Mozilla, where I guide their trustworthy AI initiatives, and also a young global leader with World Economic Forum, and previously sat on the Council of AI. So it's great to see the work that Europe started 4 years ago come to the stage, and really kudos for creating the guidelines that are going to shape where we are going next.
Navrina, thank you very much. And finally, if you could complete the panel, Charles.
Yeah, well, I'm the guy that's been spamming you all afternoon, so I'm sitting here feeling pretty ashamed of myself for not honing my Zoom skills earlier in the pandemic. So, hi everyone, I'm Charles Radcliffe. I'm sincerely apologetic for the chaos I've caused in your inboxes this afternoon. But if you're hearing me talk, it means that at least something has worked. So thank you very much for taking the time. I guess it's really exciting to be hosting this because today is a really big day, probably the biggest day since the 25th of May 2018, when GDPR came out. And what we've been building at Ethics Grade for the last 15, 16 months is a solution in the hope that these regulations would actually come out on time and roughly in the shape that we wanted them to be. So we're a ratings agency, and essentially what we do is rating organizations on the quality of their governance and their maturity towards best practice. So if you haven't seen our work, please look at ethicsgrade.io. And you can see probably your favorite and maybe some of your less favorite tech companies and how they stack up against each other.
Charles, thank you very much indeed. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you can tell, what a truly outstanding panel. And before going any further, I'd just like to invite you to share any questions you have in the Q&A as well. We'll come to those later. But let's begin. Here we are at great speed. Charles has pulled us together, this fantastic panel of experts from the US and the UK, neither in Europe. Why are we here? What is it about these regulations in the European Union which mean that they will touch all of our lives? Will they touch all of our lives? And if so, how? Since he's done so much, despite the vicissitudes of Zoom, to bring us together, I'd like to turn first to Charles to see if he can help us to answer that question. Charles, why does this matter and why are we here now?
Thanks, Ben. So I've had a lot of questions come in over the last few days to my LinkedIn post and also direct messages from those of you who've joined. And really, I think the biggest questions perhaps on people's lips is, first of all, look, this is just a draft regulation. It's going to be a couple of years before it goes through the parliamentary process. And even then there'll be an enforcement period. So why the heck do we need to worry about it now? And then secondly, for people who are not based in the EU, why on earth is this relevant? And I guess I'll try and tackle both of those in one breath. The big difference between, let's start with GDPR. GDPR was a really big moment in time for global tech regulation, because while it really fundamentally changed the way that data is used for around European citizens, what it's also done is it's spawned a lot of essentially copycat regulation around the world. And I think there's something we talk about, the Brussels effect, that it's 450 million people in the Union. It's a very big economic block. And if you're a tech company and you want to do business, in the European Union, obviously, you need to be compliant with GDPR, and it's a lot easier for you to put together a set of best practice in terms of how you're going to treat doing business in the Union, and then use that same best practice in other places that you do business as well. And so I think the obvious answer is why this is going to affect the UK is because we're so close to the Union and in an orbit of it still very much. And so we're going to see a lot of multinational firms think about their European, as a continental European approach to regulating AI, and they're going to apply the same thing. In the absence of any proper regulation in the UK, I think we'll see all the best practice apply over here as well. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if we start to see in Singapore, Canada, California, maybe New York, and certainly Australia, very similar pieces of regulation emerge over the next couple of years. But why the urgency? I guess that's the question. And why have I been frantically sort of getting my team ready to launch what we're doing before these regulations came out? And for me, it's really clear the big difference. We saw a leaked version of the regulations and we were frantically checking today, is this still true? And it is. The big urgency around this is really the difference between GDPR and this. So with GDPR, the enforcement date was 25th of May 2018. And so if you were breaching GDPR before that date, you essentially could shrug your shoulders and walk away. And that's kind of what Facebook have done with their 533 million user data breach recently. But the big difference here is that, yes, there'll be an enforcement period, but if your AI system is still within its life cycle post that enforcement period, then you're going to have to think about what the regulation says. And so that really means if you're building a machine learning platform today, and if you don't have a good idea that will be still in life, in service 4 or 5 years from now, then frankly, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Is it just purely experimental? There's clearly no return on the investment that you're doing. But most people in enterprises will be building systems today because they have the hope that those systems will be in production 4 or 5 years from now. And what this means is you're going to have to start thinking about what these regulations say and start to bring in some of the best practice, particularly quality management systems and risk management systems, and thinking about what those mean for your operations. And so I think that's the critical moment that we've reached now. We know what the regulations are broadly going to do. Yes, there'll be some tweaks. So now there's really no excuse for enterprises to start to put that best practice in place.
Charles, thank you very much indeed. And perhaps, Sarah, I can invite you to reflect on that. What's your view on why this, why now, and why us?
I think I agree broadly with everything that Charles has said. I think the other lens that I'd want to bring to it is this question of data protection adequacy and the potentially Privacy Shield 2.0 that may be coming up at some point in the future with the US. There's a hardcore negotiation already going on with that. And most of the conversations about potential inadequacy to be able to carry on transferring data between Europe and the UK and Europe and the US are very focused around things which are absolutely pertinent to AI and the operation of AI and the continuing operation of AI, because so much of the underpinning cloud infrastructure is located in the States, and much of the innovative ambition for the UK is in the area of data. So I guess that would be the other ingredient I would bring to this. And certainly that lead time to establish the understanding of your data estate and your processing estate, in particular your data flows and purposes, is not something to sneeze at, to stand up if you haven't done it for GDPR already, if you've not really been a personal data focused company, but you are a data focused company more broadly, that I know what it takes to take that journey, and it isn't trivial. It doesn't have to be necessarily onerous, but it's not necessarily quick either.
Fantastic, thank you. So I guess we can draw from this that this is something which extends its influence far beyond the boundaries of the European Union. And critically, as you've both highlighted, there is no time for delay, because although it will take some time before the regulations become enacted, nevertheless, in terms both of quality and risk management and preparation, there is no time to be lost. So thank you very much indeed. And turning now, perhaps, to look a little deeper at that, this is an area where the European Commission is putting red lines in place where AI will be banned under certain circumstances. And also there are certain high touch, high risk areas and requirements. This is something which should exercise our interests in quality management and in risk management. So Pamela, perhaps I can turn to you and ask, you have a great deal of experience of algorithmic risk management. What can we learn from you?
Yeah, sure, Ben. Thank you for that. So in terms of the regulation, I also just wanted to opine that I think that one of the reasons why this is so critical today, both in the UK and broadly speaking across the globe, is this notion of AI bias and how it's become more top of mind of most consumers and most of the population, as we've seen more and more research showing indications and instances of this bias occurring within the population due to already existing AI systems on the market. So I think that that plays into also why there's this sense of importance and emergency and heightened sense of focus on having AI regulations and the call for AI regulations, which has come largely from these populations and from the AI ethics community. But you're right, AI risk management is a very important piece and an important part of this regulation. Something to keep in mind is that in the United States and even in other countries, we've had regulations that have governed model risk management within the banking sector. There's a regulation called SR 11.7 that the FRB has mandated since the year 2011, and even in the year 2000, there has been supervisory guidance on and around model risk management. And so what is model risk? Model risk is essentially a risk metric that looks at the likelihood and probability of an error or an outcome of the model, whether it's a AI model or a non-AI model. And when we look at all of the articles and titles within the proposed and newly published regulation, we see that there are many similarities and parallels between this regulation and the regulation that's been in existence for 20 years within the United States. Namely, I think Title III, Article 7 talks about compliance and how high risk AI applications will have mandatory requirements, and that those requirements must be assessed prior to the AI product being put into production. So that assessment must be performed by what the European Union is calling a conformity assessment. And that's very similar, as an example, to what we do in model risk management called model validation and control. Model validators validate model theory, we validate the data, numerical outputs, the inputs to the data, the inputs to the model, the data sets themselves. We also assign a model grade, meaning a ranking of each individual model that moves into production. So I'm quite happy to see the regulations. I think that they're very thorough. They cover a wide variety of tenets, including bias, and it specifically mentions bias in several areas.
Pamela, thank you very much indeed. I guess now bearing in mind that deep well of expertise and relevant experience established in the financial services sector in risk management, perhaps we can focus for a moment on quality management. Now, the best organizations will already have systems in place to monitor and measure the performance of their models. If I can turn to you, Navrina, and ask, what organizations need to look for when they're implementing quality management controls and systems around their AI development?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ben. And thanks, Pamela, because I think you did a great job explaining how regulated industries like finance and banking already have the different lines of defenses to tackle some of the model risk challenges that those organizations have faced. Our prediction is those kind of structures, the different lines of defenses that have existed in finance and banking, are going to start showing up in other sectors, be it high tech, be it healthcare, employment, etc. And the reason for that is, as we think about the entire machine learning and AI lifecycle, one of the cool things that I think European Commission has done in the guidelines is emphasize quite extensively on the quality controls as well as the conformity assessment that needs to happen. So let me just unpack that a little bit for you here. So as we think about quality assessment, I think there are two core components. The first component is, what do organizations need to do internally to ensure that they have these processes in place? And Ben, you'll be surprised that we've been in discussions with most of the Global 2000 companies, and they don't have that in place right now. And then the second is, how do you do quality control from an external perspective? And that's where the conformity assessment becomes really critical. So now tackling the quality assessment, which internally organizations have to think about, I really like the framing that the European Commission's guidelines have put out there. And the way we see it is sort of 3 layers of trust that needs to be built across the organization. The first layer of trust is with the people and the accountability frameworks that needs to exist within an organization. How are the executive team going to be involved? How is the board going to stay accountable to some of these regulations? And how are the people going to come together and create a decision provenance around, not only designing of these machine learning systems, but also the deployment of these systems? So what we are going to see more and more, and something that Credo AI does very effectively, is curating an audit trail of all the decisions that went into thinking through these machine learning systems and the deployment of these systems. The second set of quality controls that companies will absolutely have to dive deeper into is around documentation, and that technical documentation not only restricted to data, the lineage of data, the quality of data, the assessment of the data, but also around the model and the AI systems. And what we are going to see more and more is the critical requirement around documenting every aspect of what was the purpose of, especially the high risk AI systems, was the purpose of those systems, how were they tested, who reviewed those models internally within the organizations before getting launched, who assigned the risk scores to these models. And then once they are launched in the market, how are we actively monitoring them and ensuring that the quality does not degrade in the production environment? So one of the core capabilities, and which I'm very excited to see in the guidelines, is around technical documentation and record keeping, because as you can imagine, that is going to become one of the sources of compliance internally, and also for the conformity assessment that needs to be done externally. And then the last component of the internal quality controls is really around what I like to call as trust with the environment, which is essentially once you've designed, developed, extensively tested these machine learning systems and AI systems, and now they're actually in production. How are we going to continuously monitor these systems, and what are the implications of production scenarios on the compliance characteristics of these models? But more importantly, when the compliance characteristics change because of changes in the environment, what is the accountability team within the enterprise actually going to do about it? And I think the guidelines very clearly state how this end-to-end life cycle needs to really be documented, logged, and has to have alert mechanisms to ensure that the right oversight and accountability is presented within the organization. So that's like what we are going to see more and more in the internal quality controls. I won't talk much about the conformity assessment because I think Pamela covered a little bit of that. But what is really exciting about the conformity assessment is this is where the external third-party auditors and assessment functions become really critical. So as companies who are developing high-risk AI systems, putting these systems out in the market, there is going to be a very thorough review of not only the technical documentation, internal controls, oversight committees by these independent, sort of like notified bodies externally, but there's also going to be documented proof that it has been reviewed and certified by these notified bodies. So I am super excited about these different layers of defenses that are getting created within the organization as well as externally to the organization.
Verena, thank you very much indeed. And I think we're getting a sense already of the massive implications of these new regulations. I'm just going to invite all of the panelists to keep one eye on both the Q&A and the chat. And if you spot a question you can engage with there, please do. In the meantime, we'll carry on, but I will of course ask everybody to continue to add their questions and their comments into both the chat and the Q&A, and we'll come to some broader questions a little later on. If I can turn to you, Seb, now. We've heard that there is a provision for the introduction of a voluntary code of conduct to be put in place. And I wonder if you can future gaze for us for a moment and advise us on what we can start to do in anticipation of that, how organizations can build the right disciplines so that signing up for those codes in due course is something that they're well aligned to do.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So yeah, it's true. I think it's section or article 69 of the regulation that states that essentially organizations, particularly sellers or users of low-risk systems, should look at adopting codes of conduct, and that's something the Commission encourages and supports. So that's obviously very, that's good. But with that in mind, I think it's also worth kind of quickly thinking about this. In that, at the end of the day, I think even if you do low-risk products, you need to take these regulations, I think, quite seriously. And then even if you're not necessarily kind of caught by the definitions of high risk, because firstly, there's a potential risk that down the line, this kind of stuff you do might be then eventually caught when the legislation gets updated. But also, in case you want to one day build a high-risk system, it's better kind of to be ready in advance rather than fumble through a few days later and try to change all your processes. So I think with that in mind, a code of conduct in this space will likely broadly mimic a lot of the requirements already in the regulation and that are being kind of developed through standard-setting organizations. And I think to do that well, or to start doing that well, I think you need two things. The first thing is a team and then a plan. So on the team side, you need to make sure you've got a good multidisciplinary team with endorsement from the leadership so that you have people who understand these issues but can work closely with both, different worlds, legal, risk, product managers, data scientists, data engineers, and so on. You need to have this kind of holistic approach to risk and AI risk in particular. And then you need to also have a good plan on the, having the right governance structures that are adequate for your company and for the kind of stuff you do. So, once you look at a code of conduct, and there's actually quite a few out there already right now, you need to be able to point to a particular kind of requirement and then point back to a process or a tool you've adopted or used to ensure that you're actually kind of doing something about it beyond just signing a document. So thinking about, how do you monitor algorithms and their outputs? Do you provide employee training? How do you deal with document retention and audit trails? How do you test models? How do you keep and maintain documentation and all this stuff? So I think that would be a good start. And I think generally ensuring you've got good quality management systems and risk management systems go a long way in actually operationalizing what code of conducts will eventually require from you.
Fantastic, Seb. Thank you very much indeed. And clearly data is at the heart of these new regulations. And so perhaps if I can turn to you next, Sarah, and ask, high quality data sets, rigorous controls towards cyber risks, these are prerequisites. How will these regulations advance the cause of data protection? And what should organizations start to think about now about how they're going to use that data?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry to interrupt you. There's very much it's going to be an evolution in the maturity of how people are viewing data provenance when it gets first collected and capturing the purpose it's collected for, because in much the same way that data protection doesn't focus on data points, it doesn't focus on systems, it doesn't focus on servers, it focuses on the purpose, the reason that you're collecting that data, the stated declared purpose. And that's also the stated requirement for a lot of the regulatory hooks in this EU AI reg as well. So capturing that, but also the holy grail we've challenged with, where you put something into an Hadoop instance or something similar, and you lose the provenance of that data, you lose the place it's come from, and the agreed purposes it was collected for. And also when you're trying to control key things like access and where making sure those buckets have proper access control on the internet, because those don't get exposed ever. The nature and scale and also the sensitivity of that data is going to be critical to deciding what appropriate controls are. So I think what we're going to see is stretching beyond the boundaries of personal data into other forms of data being processed that potentially can cause harm. We're going to have a rollout of those kind of core security controls. Advancing the cause of data protection, I think data protection's cause was pretty well advanced. I think the thing that could advance it further is perhaps a two-pronged approach to enforcement. I would very much hope to see enforcement having the promise that it's been advertised to have, and perhaps it will pull the enforcement we've maybe not seen to the level we'd have liked to see it in the GDPR come along for the ride.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. And perhaps now I can just ask, I appreciate as panelists, you've been ingesting huge amounts of information very, very fast. So I'm going to ask you to, in the same spirit, to see if you can multitask and address some of the questions we're receiving through the Q&A channel and the chat channels while we continue with the dialogue here as well. So cast one eye to the side and take a look at those, because there are some fantastic questions coming in. Meanwhile, and I'm going to give you a heads up, Charles, if you can be ready to for this question. These voluntary codes of conduct, will they work? And what about other jurisdictions? Earlier on, you mentioned that many eyes in Canada and Australia and other countries will be watching what goes on in the EU. What should they be doing, and what can we expect from them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I could talk all night about it. So I think let's just talk about the context that this has come from. So it was February 19th last year that we saw the white paper published by the Commission, and that kicked off a consultation process. And so, lots of us were involved in that. I know Seb and I were swapping notes in terms of our views on this. And, there's lots of opinions in terms of what the Commission could and should have done. People have said that this should have happened years ago. Some people say this is far too early, it's going to constrain innovation. And there's views that the Commission has done too much, and there's views that the Commission hasn't done enough. And there's certainly views of people who think that this isn't well thought out enough. And, I guess it's not my job to judge any of those things, but I think it's really interesting to see that you can't please everyone. That's for sure. In the impact assessment that the Commission ran in the latter half of last year, they set out the different directions of travel that they might take. And this is a standard part of the European legislative process to consider, here are our options, what does everyone think, and what is the impact of that going to be on the economy and fundamental rights and other questions. And so the options were, do nothing was one, and I think politically that would have been impossible to have taken that course. The second option was really around soft touch industry-led solutions, and do we just let industry figure this out, give them a bit more time, or do we kind of give some helpful nudges to industry to do something about this to raise the bar? The next level was, we're going to put some controls in places in some instances, and then obviously the top level was really intervene in all cases of AI. I think the thing which I didn't expect, frankly, was we're going to see some red lines in this, and I think that was a real pleasing thing for me. Perhaps now I've seen the red lines, I might have asked for a few more things to be banned, but I think it's really good to see that those red lines have been drafted there. We've also got mandatory controls around high risk AI. I think for the code of conduct, I mean, it's purely voluntary. We really hope that there's a market structure that incentivizes organizations to get on board with that and to start to really disclose and talk about the good governance that they've got. I mean, I know from first-hand conversations with so many big organizations that what they talk about publicly and what they actually do are two different things. And in many cases, what they have in place is greatly superior to what you can see on the outside. And so I think hopefully that this gives them a bit of framing and context for organizations to do more in that regard. And I think other jurisdictions, I said this is going to spawn copycat regulation around the world. I think there's a really great opportunity now for other parts of the world to look at these draft regulations and to start to think about how they're going to do something similar. And I hope that we're going to see two things. I hope that we're going to see, this is my personal view, I would say, I think there's a very strong consensus amongst people. I think every survey that's ever been commissioned on this has pointed to the same thing, that where people really feel that AI is crossing that creepy line is in military contexts. And so I think that that's a red line that I really wish the Commission had started to think about. Maybe we'll see that in future regulation. But I think that's something which there could be a consensus around. It's not easy to find consensus, but I think that's something. So I hope that we'll see that in other jurisdictions. And I hope we get to a point where we can have a Geneva Convention on AI. We agree on some things which are just not okay for us to do with machine learning. But I also hope that we're going to see a little bit more of a baseline for other jurisdictions to take. And I think we've seen really successful examples in the automotive sector around road safety with Euro NCAP and other NCAP scenes around the globe. What we see is a minimum standard that you have to reach in order to place your products on the market if you're in the automotive sector. But then above that, industry have been free to collaborate and to really agree on best practice. And so the NCAP 5-star rating system has been a really successful way of reducing road deaths, minimizing injuries in road accidents, but at the same time, limiting regulatory interference into the automotive sector. And so I kind of hoped to have seen something a little bit similar to that, but you don't get everything you want, perhaps. But I do think that we'll start to see other jurisdictions consider that. And for me, that would be the fully balanced diet of meat, veg, and a bit of dessert and icing on top.
Fantastic, thank you. And what a nourishing thought that is. I guess we've got some fantastic questions coming in as well, and perspectives from Africa, from Canada as well. Questions about particular sectors, and some of those have already been answered, I think, in the parallel Q&A. But we've also had a question in about the time taken to introduce these regulations. And so I'm going to ask the next question really on the topic of long-term thinking. And this is one for you, Navrina. Given that AI systems might take a number of years to move from experimentation and development through to deployment into the market and ultimately eventually decommissioning, what should organizations be doing now to prepare for that full life cycle of artificial intelligence subject to these regulations?
That's a great question, Ben. I do want to highlight for this group that within the sectors that I like to call as AI first, This could be in finance and banking, high tech, healthcare. We are actually seeing that organizations already have thousands of machine learning models in production at scale. So, but there is this massive middle, which we like to call as tech forward organizations, where I would say that they're at an interesting phase of experimentation and figuring out their strategy for deployment. So what that basically indicates between the tech forward and the AI first companies is that there's already been a shift into production ready at scale machine learning models. So what this means is, and why this regulation becomes really, or at least these guidelines become really critical, is that machine learning is going to be pervasive and AI is going to be pervasive in every sector that we can potentially think about. So organizations now have to sort of take a step back and really evaluate if they are building their house, how do they lay the foundation well so that it can weather different storms? And what I mean by weathering different storms is, as we have seen in these guidelines, that there are different definitions of or examples of high risk, medium risk, low risk models. And I think what we are going to see from regulations all around the world is that they'll have different use cases that fall in those categories. And as you know, whether it is credit underwriting, whether it is algorithms for employment, or whether it is facial recognition systems, or it is chatbots, one of the things that has become very clear through these guidelines is the enterprises, whether they already have machine learning systems in production or are experimenting to really take these systems out in the market, they will need to pay very, very strong attention to what does good governance and oversight mean. And I couldn't agree more with Seb that now is the time to really create a mechanism by which multi-stakeholder engagement becomes critical. So we have seen this firsthand at Credo is, ML ops tools which have existed to really increase the speed of experimentation and the deployment of these systems in the market are really catered for data scientists and the technical audiences. But if we think about, folks like Pamela who have the experience and expertise in risk management and are incentivized to manage that risk, right now, there is no clear pathway to enable this multi-stakeholder conversation to happen. And this is the massive difference between the AI expertise between the business and the technical stakeholders is what's causing the AI governance chasm. And so where the EU point of view actually plays a role is it's going to actually help build the bridge that is going to help cross the AI governance chasm by putting the right quality controls in place, by putting a point of view on conformment assessment. So to answer your question, what do companies have to do to pay attention to this end-to-end life cycle? I think they really have to start thinking about multi-stakeholder oversight committees. They have to really think about multi-stakeholder quality and documentation and record keeping platforms and tools so that the end-to-end process is sort of curated in an auditable trace that can not only be used by internal teams, by external regulators as well. And right now is the time for organizations who are reaping the benefits from machine learning and AI to start putting these key building blocks in place. And this is going to be just one of the many regulatory guidelines that we're going to see show up across the world.
Navrina, thank you very much indeed. And clearly that multi-stakeholder engagement is going to be front and center preoccupation and set of skills and disciplines for us all for a long time to come. On a slightly different note, Charles, you highlighted that a notable exclusion from these regulations is the military use of artificial intelligence. Why was it out of scope? Seb, if I can turn to you and ask, should there be and could there be something like a Geneva Convention for artificial intelligence? And if so, when?
Not very soon, but I think, so essentially military applications are excluded because I think these use cases kind of fall outside the scope of EU treaties. So it's often isn't for the Commission, I think, to regulate how national militaries use developed technology or AI. So in short, member states usually have the last word on kind of national security matters. But it doesn't mean they're not keeping an eye on this. There was a report back in January by European kind of MEPs calling for the EU to take a leading role in promoting a global framework governing military use of AI. alongside the UN and the international community. They're thinking about this, and I think there's good reasons to be concerned. It'll only be a matter of time until some applications appear on the black market or in the hands of non-state actors, or even state actors, with dictators wishing to better control the population and so on. So I think there's definitely stuff to be done, work to be done here, but whether it'll actually happen and soon, I'm not too sure. I think many right now view global agreements of this nature as being very fanciful, especially when countries like the UK, US, Russia, China, and so on are likely to oppose them. And but on the other hand, I do think there's a real desire from the Biden administration to return to a world supportive of multilateralism. So there should definitely be more to clarify how AI should be used in warfare, not used, from lethal autonomous weapons to deterrence systems. So I'm not sure there'll be a Geneva Convention coming up soon for AI, but I'd be hopeful that existing legislation and frameworks could at least be updated and reflect some of the new risks that AI brings.
Seb, thank you very much indeed. And as you've been speaking, I'm afraid to say that the panelists have started to lose the battle of question and answer. So if I can invite you all to continue to engage with the fantastic stream of questions that we're getting through Q&A and also through the chat. I'm conscious that time is not on our side. So I'm just going to ask one more question. And Pamela, this is for you, if I may. The practical risk management of artificial intelligence systems, how practical is it, given that machine learning engineers aren't really responsible for how many of these systems are used in the field? The hands-on practicality, as we consider, of course, the big conceptual implications of this, we have a lot to digest. But what do you think we need to do to change the way we actually manage implementation?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great question. And so to concur with what some other folks have been saying, organizations will need to really beef up their internal governance of AI risk and AI risk management systems. They can do that by appointing a designated AI risk officer who will have oversight of all of these activities and all of these documentation items and matrices that must be reported both internally as well as externally to external organizations. Banks, in terms of in response to SR 11.7, have created what are called model risk governance boards. So there already exists within financial services a multi-stakeholder board governance over model risk management. What's not included in these banking oversights and overviews are specific metrics around bias and around ethics, which I think the regulation has cited in many ways, both explicitly and both implicitly, in terms of its focus on protecting European persons from various forms of harm. So having an internal board is a part of that. Having your own internal set of policies and procedures. This is what my firm, all of these actions are what my firm can help you with and assist you with, that are documented based on the regulations and how your firm views these regulations and interprets these regulations in terms of your own business model and business culture. Practically, we're looking at implementing risk management, AI risk, through the model life cycle, the AI model life cycle. So documentation will have to be something that is shored up during each of these phases, during the identification of data. How did you identify that data, and whether or not it has any errors, whether it's statistically sound, your feature engineering processes, all of those steps that you take will need to be documented. Your training data, splicing that into your actual testing data, the model selection process itself. The good thing is that there are already in existence a robust set of tools on the market in terms of explainable AI, in terms of documenting models through model cards, data sheets, etc., that can support this process. But there will be the organization will need to take active steps towards looking at it. My sense is that it's very practical and very doable because we've been doing it now in the financial sector for over 10 years. And so I'm very optimistic about the requirements here. The other last thing I wanted to mention is that this regulation not only governs European AI providers, but also third-party providers in other countries who want to create AI that ultimately will affect European persons. So just because you're in the United States and you're Google or whomever you are, that doesn't mean that these provisions won't affect you. If your AI product will target or affect European persons, you're subject, and you're within the high risk category, you're subject to these mandatory regulations. Again, they're doable. I've worked with banks for many, many years and other companies helping them to accommodate these types of regulations.
Pamela, thank you very much indeed. You've clearly confirmed the massive scope of these regulations, but also the fact that there is plenty of established expertise available to those who want to turn their attention to preparation. We haven't quite addressed all of the questions in the Q&A channel. I'm going to pick out one theme from them, which is really, we've scratched the surface here. We have highlighted the importance and scope of these regulations. But of course, this is just the beginning. So perhaps, Charles, if I can turn to you really to draw this together for us and to make sure that we're all best placed to know who's going to win, how we can be involved, and how we can make sure we stay informed as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I guess to pick up on one thing that Pam said, I wish there had been an extra jurisdictional aspect to the proposal, because it would certainly be good if it was impacting European citizens outside of the Union. But at least on the same token, it does impact non-European citizens in the EU. So I guess you can't have your cake and eat it, to paraphrase a well-known politician. So I think the thing on everyone's lips at the end of today is going to be, well, what do I need to do? And the answer hopefully isn't read 138 pages of the Commission's finest. So the thing I think that's so critical now is for organizations to start off and make sure that they have a full inventory of the machine learning that they have in their organization. And this is something I can speak. I used to head up AI at a large pensions firm. This was really the first task in my role there, was to put my arms around what actually are we doing as an organization. And I know that so many firms, large and small, just don't have that single view in terms of what is the extent of the machine learning that we're buying into the organization, that we're building, that we're experimenting with it within innovation functions. So I think that's the first step, is to build that inventory. The second step is going to be to do a risk management exercise. You absolutely need to know whether you're going to be caught by the high risk activities. And if obviously what you're doing is subject to the prohibited list, then you're probably going to have to rethink some aspects of your business model. So I think that's the first exercise you need to do. If you're in the high risk zone, then a quality management system and risk management best practices are hopefully what you're already doing as an organization, but we can see from the polls that that's not maybe the case universally. So that's really the next step, is to make sure you're putting those best practices in place. And I know from my experience with the finance industry, and it's great to have Pam on the call, SO 11.7 is we've solved for these problems before in the financial markets in many cases, in terms of the controls that need to be put in place, and systems and solutions exist. I guess the MLOps community is a little bit more early stage, but again, there are platforms out in the market, and if you want to know who to talk to, then Navarina is the person that you should start with. So that's the good news. And then obviously there's the other things which are considered low risk, but there's disclosure requirements around. So if you're in the business of chatbots, or if you're thinking about those sort of things, then that's probably a simple change for you to make. But why wait 4 years for these things to be live? Why not just get that done now? Because it's clearly, this is the direction of travel towards best practice. There's obviously a lot more detail, particularly around the high risk activities, the central database, which we haven't talked about, notified bodies, conformity assessments. there's a huge amount of detail living behind all this. But essentially, you know, the takeaway, you know, if you're in an executive function, what do you need to know? The first thing you need to do is have that inventory in place. Understand what does your estate look like, do the risk assessment, and then put in place some best practice around quality and risk. The third thing I would say, which obviously industry-led codes of conduct are going to push towards is around managing ethical concerns and really making sure your organization navigates the trust gap that we found over the last few years and gets that right and doesn't suffer reputational consequences. The Act doesn't speak so much of stakeholder engagement, but I think that is a critical thing. And, you know, I'm certainly happy to talk to people about that if they would like to speak afterwards. But yeah, the key takeaway here is, you know, there's nothing in this which is reinventing the wheel. All the best practice is out there, and now is a great opportunity for organisations to pull together and get this done. And I'm just very grateful to the other panelists for sharing their expertise. I think individually and collectively we've got a really great bunch of people here, and yeah, super grateful to you all for coming together at the last minute and on the day itself, which I think is a no mean feat. So well done, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you all very much indeed. You've taken over 100 pages of prose and turned it into succinct and actionable poetry. It's been a pleasure to bring you panelists together, and also thank you very much indeed to everyone who's been involved. You've produced some fantastic questions. We have answered some. There's much more to follow. So please keep in touch, and thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks, everyone.